The sun was slowly setting over the Nova Esperanza condominium, where the luxury apartments glowed in the golden light, reflecting the exclusivity that its residents valued so much. The tranquility of that space was almost palpable, marked by the respectful silence that permeated the hallways and common areas. However, behind that facade of harmony, there was a spirit of elitism that made many feel comfortable maintaining their traditions. Among the residents was Mrs. Mendez, a middle-aged woman with a critical eye and a sharp tongue. She closely watched her neighbors' every move, always ready to make snide remarks. To her, the condominium represented a status that had to be defended at all costs. The idea of change made her uncomfortable, especially when it came to new residents who, in her view, did not fit the established profile. It was into this setting that Dr. Lucas, a respected physician known for his hard work, arrived to move in. After years dedicated to his career, he was looking for a new home, a space where he could relax and find some peace. The contrast between his profession and the atmosphere of the condominium was palpable. Dr. Lucas was a kind man who always believed in the importance of empathy and respect. As Dr. Lucas got out of the car with a few boxes, his vibrant energy and welcoming smile contrasted with the coldness of the environment. He greeted the few neighbors who passed by, but soon noticed strange looks and restrained murmurs. It bothered him, but he chose to ignore it, focusing on the expectation of starting over in a place where he could feel at home. However, Mrs. Mendez was alert. Upon noticing the change, she immediately began to form her own opinions. "Another stranger in my condominium," she thought, already wondering what she could do to protect the environment she valued so much. The idea of a new resident, especially a black man, awakened her prejudiced instincts. As Dr. Lucas settled in, Mrs. Mendez decided she couldn't leave the situation in his hands. With a mixture of curiosity and disdain, she began to pay closer attention to the doctor's habits, planning an approach that would ensure the order of the condominium would not be threatened. That night, as Dr. Lucas organized his things and prepared for the new phase of his life, Mrs. Mendez leaned back in her chair, feeling a mixture of anger and unease. It was only the beginning, but she was already determined to make this intruder know that he was not welcome. Tension was in the air, and a new chapter of history was about to unfold, where hidden prejudices and unexpected breakthroughs would intertwine in ways that no one could have foreseen. The next day dawned bright and sunny, bringing with it the expectation of a new beginning for Dr. Lucas. He was eager to integrate into the community of the Nova Esperanza condominium. After a quick breakfast, he decided it would be a good idea to invite some friends over for a small welcome party. The idea was simple: music, laughter, and a relaxed moment to break the ice. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Lucas' friends began arriving, bringing food and entertainment. The atmosphere quickly changed. Laughter echoed through the hallways and lively music filled the space, creating a welcoming atmosphere that reflected the joy of the moment. Dr. Lucas, with his friendly and charismatic manner, made a point of introducing each of his friends to the neighbors who passed by, trying to appear approachable and friendly. Meanwhile, as the celebration took shape, Mrs. Mendez watched from her apartment. She couldn't hide her discontented expression as she listened to the music and laughter. Her heart clenched with a mixture of anger and resentment. "How dare he make noise here?" she thought, her mind filled with judgments. To her, the party was an affront to what she considered acceptable standards of conduct. Determined to act, Mrs. Mendez left her home and, with a stern look, began to argue with other residents about what she considered unacceptable behavior. She stated that Dr. Lucas did not belong there and that he needed to be put in his place. Her comments began to sow distrust among the neighbors, who, until then, had not formed an opinion about the new resident. The party continued, and Dr. Lucas was having fun. The music was playing, the conversations were flowing, and a sense of belonging was beginning to emerge. However, he couldn't help but notice the strange looks from some of the residents who passed by the hallway. Maybe they're just shy, he thought, trying not to let it get to him. However, a friend, noticing the change in Dr. Lucas's expression, commented, "Have you heard the rumors? Mrs. Mendez doesn't seem too happy about your presence." That statement made Dr. Lucas's heart sink. He had always believed in the importance of inclusion and respect, and the idea of being the target of prejudice made him deeply uncomfortable. The party progressed, but the mood began to change. The once light and fun energy was now tinged with subtle tension. Dr. Lucas tried to push away the negative thoughts, but the seed of distrust had been planted. Mrs. Mendez was determined to act, and he had no idea what was coming. As the night drew to a close, Mrs. Mendez prepared to take the next step, convinced that she was doing the right thing to protect her condominium. The battle of prejudices was just beginning, and Dr. Lucas, without even knowing it, was about to find himself at the center of a storm that would challenge everything he believed in. The morning after the party, the atmosphere in the condominium was tense. Mrs. Mendez woke up determined to spread the word about Dr. Lucas. She started her day as usual, but instead of preparing breakfast, her mind was fixed on how to expose the threat she considered the new resident. Soon, she went down to the lobby, where some neighbors were gathered. With a sly smile, she began to comment on Dr. Lucas's behavior at the party. "Did you see how noisy he was? That's not acceptable for a condominium like ours," she said, trying to get the others' attention. The seed of distrust was beginning to germinate in the residents' minds. The neighbors listened, some nodding, others exchanging uncertain glances. Mrs. Mendez, sensing the receptiveness, deepened her criticism. "I'm not sure he's the right person to be here. Don't we have enough rules already?" Murmurs of approval began to echo among them, and Mrs. Mendez felt victorious. Meanwhile, Dr. Lucas continued to adjust to his new life. He was eager to find a new rhythm, wanting to integrate even more into the community. However, as the day went on, he began to notice the strange atmosphere. The greetings that had once been warm were now cold and distant. It made him feel uneasy, but he decided to ignore it and focus on his work and his new routine. But the chatter around the condo didn't stop. Mrs. Mendez was omnipresent, and her words were beginning to paint a negative picture of Dr. Lucas. Even those who had initially been receptive began to back away, harboring doubts about his presence. "He seems too good to be true," a neighbor whispered, and words spread like wildfire. Dr. Lucas, faced with curious looks and whispers, began to feel that the distrust was not just a passing impression. That feeling of being watched followed him like a shadow. He tried to ignore it, but each new look, each conversation that ceased as he passed, reinforced the idea that something was wrong. That night, as he tried to relax, Dr. Lucas couldn't help but reflect. He sat on his porch, looking up at the stars, and remembered his journey to this point. He had faced challenges and prejudices at different stages of his life, but what was happening now seemed like a painful repetition. How could there be so much judgment in a place that was supposed to be home? Mrs. Mendez, for her part, was pleased with the impact her words had made. She felt like the guardian of the condominium, determined to maintain order at any cost. The discussions and suspicions she had generated had left her excited, as if she were fulfilling a mission. But with each word she uttered, the line between protection and prejudice became more blurred. The night wore on, and the seed of distrust planted by Mrs. Mendez began to sprout in the form of judgment and exclusion. Dr. Lucas didn't know it, but the storm was about to intensify, and he would soon find himself at the center of a conflict that could change everything. The routine of the condominium continued, but tension hung in the air like a dark cloud. Mrs. Mendez, now more determined than ever, began to devise her strategy to deal with what she saw as a threat to the peace of the place she valued so much. With each passing day, her aversion to Dr. Lucas grew, and she decided that she could no longer ignore the inadequacy of the new resident. One sunny day, as the residents gathered in the common area, Mrs. Mendez found the perfect opportunity. With a cynical smile, she approached a group of neighbors discussing trivialities. "Have you heard about the new doctor?" she asked, her sweet voice masking malicious intent. Heads turned toward her, and she continued, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time to call security. He was loud at the party and doesn't seem to be respecting our rules." The murmurs of approval began to grow louder. Neighbors who had previously been neutral now seemed to rally to her cause. Ms. Mendez felt like a hero, defending her condominium against the invasion of someone who, in her mind, had no right to be there. "We need to make sure our space is safe and comfortable for everyone," she insisted. With the idea planted, Mrs. Mendez decided she would act. She left the group, her heart racing, feeling that she was about to make a decision that would change the course of the situation. In her mind, the logic was clear. She could not allow the new resident to feel comfortable. It was time to show him who was really in charge here. That same day, as Dr. Lucas walked down the hallway, he felt Mrs. Mendez's gaze on him, intense and assessing. He tried to ignore her, focusing on his new life, but the pressure was building. Mrs. Mendez was no longer just a neighbor. She had become an oppressive, judgmental shadow. After a long day at work, Dr. Lucas decided to relax at home. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mendez prepared to make the call. With the phone in her hand, her mind was full of justifications. "I'm just protecting my community," she thought, convincing herself that she was doing the right thing. It was time to call the condominium security. She dialed the number, and within minutes, one of the security guards arrived at the building, already familiar with Mrs. Mendez. With a serious expression, he listened to her complaints about the new resident. Her words flowed like poison, creating a narrative that distorted reality and increased distrust. Dr. Lucas, on the other hand, was oblivious to what was happening. He was preparing a light and relaxing dinner, unaware that his peace was about to be interrupted. When the sound of the doorbell cut through the silence, he didn't hesitate to open the door, thinking it was a friend or neighbor. However, when he found the security of the condominium in front of him, his expression quickly changed from surprise to confusion. What was supposed to be a new stage in her life was about to turn into a nightmare, and Mrs. Mendez watched everything from the hallway, satisfied and triumphant, unaware that her actions would trigger a series of events that would change the dynamics of the condominium forever. Dr. Lucas opened the door, smiling, but his smile quickly faded when he saw the security guard of the condominium. The man, with a serious expression, said, "Dr. Lucas, we need to talk." Those words, loaded with a weight that Dr. Lucas could not understand, made him uneasy. He moved away from the door, making room for the security guard to enter. "What are we talking about?" Dr. Lucas asked, trying to remain calm. He had already sensed that there was something wrong with the looks on his neighbors' faces, but he never imagined that it would result in a visit from security. "We've received some complaints about the noise coming from your unit. Ms. Mendez expressed concerns about your party and general behavior," the security guard explained, his voice professional and emotionless. Dr. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He had never imagined that such an innocent celebration could cause such a commotion. "I had no idea I was bothering anyone. It was a small party with friends," he replied, a little frustrated. "I just moved here and was trying to fit in." The security guard looked at him sympathetically, but soon became neutral. "I understand, Dr. Lucas, but the condominium rules are clear. It is important to keep noise levels under control, especially in residential areas. Unfortunately, Mrs. Mendez feels uncomfortable and is already concerned about the atmosphere here." As the security guard spoke, Dr. Lucas felt a wave of indignation rise within him. He had always believed in fostering an inclusive and welcoming community, but the situation unfolding before him seemed contrary to every principle he held dear. "Can I talk to Mrs. Mendez about this?" he asked, determined to clear things up. The security guard hesitated, but nodded, apparently out of options. "If you think you can work it out, that might help." As Dr. Lucas walked out of his unit and headed to Ms. Mendez's apartment, the tension was palpable. He was determined to face the situation with dignity, but the fear of confrontation was inevitable. As he knocked on Ms. Mendez's door, his mind was full of questions. How could someone be so hostile without even knowing a person? Mrs. Mendez opened the door, and her gaze immediately revealed a mixture of surprise and disdain. "What do you want, Dr. Lucas?" she asked, in a tone of voice that did not hide her distrust. "I'd like to talk about your grievances," he said, trying to keep his tone respectful. "I'm here to integrate, and if I did something that bothered you, I'd like to make it right." She looked him up and down, as if deciding if he was worthy of her attention. "You made noise, and that's not acceptable here. The condo isn't a place for parties," she snapped, her voice firm. Dr. Lucas felt his frustration growing. "But I just wanted to meet my neighbors. I can't understand how a small celebration can cause such a stir. Isn't that what communities do? Come together and support each other?" Mrs. Mendez crossed her arms defiantly. I think you should be more concerned with fitting in than socializing. Some people just don't belong here." With those words, the tension between them reached a peak. Dr. Lucas realized that he was up against not just Mrs. Mendez, but an entire system of prejudices that he hadn't known existed in his new home. As the tension grew, the future of their relationship seemed increasingly uncertain. Mrs. Mendez, convinced of her mission, was unwilling to back down, and Dr. Lucas was about to discover that the fight for acceptance in his new home would be more difficult than he had ever imagined. After the tense confrontation with Ms. Mendez, Dr. Lucas walked away from her door, his heart heavy and his mind churning with conflicting emotions. He could not believe that a simple attempt at interaction had triggered such hostility. When he returned to his unit, he felt alone and isolated, as if he had walked into a battlefield without knowing there was a war going on. In the days that followed, tensions in the condominium intensified. Mrs. Mendez, feeling victorious after the confrontation, began to intensify her campaign. In casual conversations with other neighbors, she spared no effort to reinforce her negative narrative about Dr. Lucas, using expressions loaded with contempt. "He's noisy and doesn't respect our rules," she would say, as if her word were law. The murmurs spread, and the distrust that had once been subtle was now evident. Residents who had once greeted Dr. Lucas began to avoid him, exchanging meaningful glances as he passed. The feeling of being watched and judged became unbearable. Dr. Lucas, who had always seen himself as someone who could make a difference in his new community, began to feel like an outcast. One morning, he decided he could no longer live this way. "I have to stand up for myself," he thought, determined to restore the truth. He invited some neighbors he knew to an informal gathering at his unit. "Maybe they will hear my side of the story," he thought hopefully. As the meeting began, Dr. Lucas realized that while some neighbors were willing to listen, there was a barrier of distrust. He began to talk about his intentions in moving into the complex, emphasizing his desire to be a good neighbor and contribute to the community. "I really didn't realize the party had caused any discomfort," he explained. "My goal was just to get to know you better. If there are rules I'm not aware of, I'm willing to respect them." Some neighbors nodded, but others remained skeptical. Mrs. Mendez, not happy with the meeting, decided to intervene. She entered uninvited, her presence heavy and intimidating. "Ah, I see you're trying to manipulate the situation to your advantage," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Dr. Lucas took a deep breath. "I'm not trying to manipulate anything. I just want to set the record straight. We all deserve a chance to get to know each other. No one here is doing anything wrong except judging without knowing." Ms. Mendez, determined to maintain her control, glared. "And who's to say you won't make more noise? This is a community, not a party space. If you can't respect that, perhaps you should reconsider your presence here." The tension in the room grew. The neighbors, torn between Dr. Lucas's words and Mrs. Mendez's authoritarian stance, exchanged nervous glances. Dr. Lucas felt he was about to lose the battle he so desperately wanted to win. "I'm not an intruder," he stated with conviction. "I'm just someone who wants a place to call home." As the discussion intensified, Dr. Lucas realized he needed more than words. It was time to join forces with other residents who might also be tired of the hostility and exclusion. He decided it was time to take action, not just to defend himself, but to fight for what he believed was right. After the tense meeting, Dr. Lucas felt discouraged, but also more determined than ever to change the narrative. He knew he needed to find allies in the community, people who shared his values of inclusion and empathy. To that end, he decided to take a different approach, not just advocating for himself, but also listening to others. The next morning, while walking through his condominium, he met Ms. Clara, an elderly neighbor who always greeted him with a smile. He invited her to his unit for coffee, hoping she could offer a different perspective on the situation. Ms. Clara, with her warm and welcoming manner, immediately accepted. While they were having coffee, Dr. Lucas decided to share his feelings. "Ms. Clara, I feel so out of place here. I feel like I've been misunderstood. I just wanted to fit in, but now Ms. Mendez and other neighbors seem to be against me." She looked at him compassionately. "I've seen how Mrs. Mendez has been acting. She's a difficult person, and her influence is powerful here. But don't let it get to you, dear. A lot of people really appreciate you. It's just that Mrs. Mendez has a way of intimidating. Dr. Lucas felt a surge of hope. Do you think you could help me talk to other neighbors? Maybe if more people knew who I really am, it could change the situation. Mrs. Clara smiled, her eyes shining. Sure. I can make some phone calls and organize a small meeting. People need to hear your story and understand that you are a good neighbor. Let's do this. With Mrs. Clara's help, the idea for a reunion began to take shape. Dr. Lucas spent the next few days preparing, talking to other neighbors, and creating a welcoming environment. He wanted everyone to feel comfortable sharing their experiences and feelings. On the day of the meeting, the atmosphere was different. The neighbors entered one by one, hesitant but curious. Dr. Lucas made sure to greet each of them with a genuine smile, thanking them for coming. Miss Clara helped break the ice, sharing stories of how the condominium had always been a place where people helped each other. When Dr. Lucas was given the chance to speak, he made sure to approach the situation delicately. I want to start by apologizing if I caused any discomfort. The last thing I wanted to do was disrespect the rules of the community. I'm here to make friends and contribute, not to create division. Their eyes met, and the tension began to dissipate. Dr. Lucas then encouraged the neighbors to talk about their own experiences. Several began to open up, sharing stories of times they had felt excluded or misunderstood. It was as if, in that moment, a new dialogue was emerging. Mrs. Mendez, however, was not oblivious to all this. She watched from afar with an expression of disdain. She could not bear to see the dynamic change and began to intervene. This is just a ploy of his to gain sympathy. We cannot allow him to manipulate us. But rather than causing further division, his words served to bring neighbors closer together. Enough with the gossip and misunderstandings, one resident said. We need an environment where everyone can feel safe and respected. The meeting became a space of empathy and support, and Dr. Lucas began to realize that, even in the face of hostility, there were people willing to listen and welcome him. This unexpected support lit a flame of hope in his heart, making him feel that perhaps there was still a way to restore harmony in the condominium. With this new alliance, Dr. Lucas felt empowered and ready to face the next battle. Not only to clear his name, but to build a community where everyone could feel at home. With the support of Miss Clara and the neighbors who rallied around him, Dr. Lucas was more motivated than ever to transform the hostile climate in the condominium. He decided that the next step would be a meeting with all the residents, including Ms. Mendez, where everyone could discuss their concerns openly and find a way forward together. He began planning the event, ensuring that it would be welcoming and inclusive. With Mrs. Clara's help, he organized a small snack and set up a common area in the condominium where neighbors could gather without formalities. The idea was to create an environment where everyone would feel comfortable expressing their feelings and opinions. On the night of the big meeting, the air was thick with anticipation. Dr. Lucas arrived early to set up the place, arranging tables and chairs in a circle, a configuration that encouraged conversation. As residents arrived, he greeted them warmly, trying to dispel any nervousness. Once everyone was settled, Dr. Lucas took the floor. Thank you for being here. I believe that we all want to live in harmony, and to do so we need to listen to each other. I am here to understand your concerns, and so that we can find solutions together. Mrs. Mendez was reluctantly present, but her posture was defensive. She crossed her arms and watched everything with a critical eye. Dr. Lucas, sensing the tension in the air, made sure to direct his words to everyone, not just her. I know some people have concerns about my presence here. I want to assure you that my goal is to be a good neighbor and contribute positively to our community. As the conversation continued, a few voices were raised. One resident, Mr. Almeida, spoke about how he felt intimidated by Ms. Mendez on occasion. Others also shared experiences of exclusion and fear of speaking out. The mood began to change, and empathy began to establish itself in the group. Finally, Mrs. Mendez could contain herself no longer. I think we all know that the behavior of some people can affect the peace of the condominium. We can't just ignore that, she said, her voice raised. Dr. Lucas, realizing that the moment was crucial, responded calmly. I understand that we all have different experiences and perspectives. What I want is for us to find a middle ground, where we can respect the rules and at the same time cultivate a friendly environment. At that moment, another neighbor, Mrs. Garcia raised her hand. "I think we need to create a space where we can get to know each other better. Maybe have monthly meetings or events. That could help ease tensions." The idea was met with enthusiasm, and soon a series of suggestions began to emerge. Dr. Lucas felt that the seeds of a new era were being planted. With this, he realized that the true power of transformation lay in the unity of the residents and in the willingness of everyone to overcome divisions. Mrs. Mendez, though still resistant, seemed to be reflecting on the conversation. Dr. Lucas noticed a slight change in her demeanor. Instead of just being a source of resistance, she was perhaps beginning to realize that she could be part of the solution, just like everyone else. As the meeting progressed, Dr. Lucas felt more hopeful than ever. He knew that fighting prejudice and hostility was not easy, but he now had allies. Together, they were ready to transform not only their own perceptions, but also the culture of the community. What began as a challenge could very well become a story of resilience and community transformation.